Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. And today we want to talk about something that once was but is no more. And that is, of course, the great streetcar system which operated here from 1884 until 1931. Now, if we view Pensacola in the early 1880s, it was an expanding city. People were moving out of the lower area, beginning what we now call North Hill, moving a little bit to the north and then to the east. And as they did that, this created problems because in those days getting back and forth was difficult. And in 1884, something happened that changed that. In that year, a young man by the name of Conrad Kupfrian, who had been employed by one of the larger companies in town, was sent to St. Louis to do some additional study. And as he got off the train and walked out of Union Depot there, he walked out in the street, and there was something right in front of him he'd never seen before. Now, of course, these things had been around a while, but Kupfrian had never seen them, and certainly they had not been here, and that was a horse-drawn streetcar. Now, the streetcar, as I say, had been around the idea of having an omnibus-type vehicle pulled by horses on major streets and on tracks on major streets. That had been around since the 1840s, but Pensacola hadn't seen it. Conrad Kupfrian said, "This is an answer to a prayer. We need to do this in Pensacola." He came back and developed a relationship with two partners, men named Cosgrove and Pfeiffer. They put down on paper a working plan, a business plan for a streetcar system, took it to the city council, and after a long debate, the city council agreed that this could proceed. And so in the period 1884-85, the Pensacola Transit Company came into being, I'm afraid the original name was the Pensacola Streetcar Company, came into being, and the original route was to run from the corner of Main Street at Jefferson, going west to Palafox, then north up Palafox Street to right, and then a turn to the east to the L&N depot there. And of course, when that began, of course, all of these cars were horse-drawn. They could accommodate perhaps 15 to 16 passengers. The fare was a nickel, and the cars ran a schedule 18 hours long, and both Kupfrian and his partners promised that there would be a car by at least every 10 minutes during the operating hours, and so they started. It was a grand success because the presence of the streetcar on that route quickly promoted the building of other routes, so that there were car routes that ran a little bit to the north of the original, then west as far as DeVilla Street, south down DeVilla, and then a little bit later, of course, in our story, into the early part of the 20th century, the Bars family really promoted and developed a streetcar route that ran all the way over into what they called their East Hill program, because they were trying to run a streetcar there to help sell the real estate. Well, the cars were a grand success. People loved them. By the time we reached 1892-93, the generation of electricity made it possible to electrify the cars within the city, and they did that. Now, to operate all of this, of course, you had to have a stable. The original cars had to have a stable for the horses. There had to be a car barn. There had to be a maintenance shop, and these were up on North DeVilla Street. And you had to have a group of men who were dedicated to the work. Now, each car, of course, was operated by what they called a leader. In the beginning, they called him the leader, and then the man at the back of the car who collected the fares, he was called the conductor. Once the cars were electrified, the man at the front, his title was changed, and he became the motorman. And of course, the cars operated by electricity had to have a wire strung across along the route, and the car had a connector, a rod that was from the electric motor in the car up to the electric source, and that worked very nicely as well. Now, people loved the streetcar because just consider that if you were a homemaker living up in the new North Hill, now you had a way to get down south, first of all for your shopping, and of course to come south for your services on Sunday, and coming south for some of the entertainments you might enjoy at the Opera House or in the public square. The streetcar was wonderful. Now, at first the cars were relatively small. Now, by the time you get into the later part of the 1890s, the cars are enlarged. They are a little more comfortable. And once the company was reorganized, it was possible for them to have what they called summer cars. These were cars that weren't closed in on the sides, but literally had the sides open. They had running boards along the side, so that if one came along, you could simply hop on the car that way and sit in a seat, and you were open to the breezes, which made the riding, of course, a great deal more comfortable. Now, these cars were not large. They were 20 to 24 feet long. The seats were generally covered with what they called cane. It was a hard varnished, not a fabric, but a fiber surface. It was strong and sturdy, and the seats were such that on some of the cars they could literally be reversed. So if the motorman and the conductor wanted to reroute the car coming back, and with people looking out the window in the right direction, they could do it that way. Well, the streetcar itself had to be reorganized. The company itself had to be reorganized in the early 1890s. The original company had fallen into some financial difficulties, and a new company which became known as the Pensacola Transit Company, became the operators. And this company not only electrified the original system in the town, but they now built a new line which was to run from Main Street and Jefferson all the way out to the Navy Yard. Now, at first, this was not an electrified railroad, but was to be pulled by small steam locomotives. And for some reason, I don't know the origin of this, but these little engines, which were generally made by the Baldwin Locomotive Company up in Pennsylvania, they were called dummy engines. And so as the new line was put in force, which ran several trips a day back and forth, this became known as the dummy line. And the route of this line was very close to the bay, and very close, ran right along on the north side of where some of the wealthier people had built summer homes out right along the bay, where the country club, where the country club would be placed early in the 20th century. Well, with the presence of the dummy line there, with regular service back and forth, some of the people said, well, now that it's so convenient to get back and forth, let's change this summer home into our permanent residence. And so the beautiful homes that were built there along the bay shore were the result of the presence of the dummy line. And of course, the dummy line itself, its primary purpose, purposes really, was to take workers from downtown to the Navy Yard. And also this became the freight line, which took building materials or other products, other elements materials that the Navy needed. And this became a double-edged sword, if you will, carrying passengers and freight back and forth, with a first train leaving early in the morning, about 5:30, to get people out there to work on time. And the dummy line would operate up until about 11 o'clock each night. It was a major factor here, helping build traffic in that direction, build and open up, if you will, to development, that area out to the west. And of course, the dummy line operated here well into the 20th century, up until about the early part of the 1950s. Well, into the early part of the 20th century, the routes inside the town expanded. People were riding back and forth more and more. And by the time we get to the early part of the 1920s, the downtown streetcar company was carrying more than 1 million passengers a year, and it was an extremely profitable business. And it was doing, as they modernized and they got better cars, they had more routes that they traveled. And so the people could move back and forth and just enjoy all sorts of things from the streetcar because of the streetcar. And one of the things that we don't want to overlook in this, and this of course goes back to the time when Conrad Kupfrian was still active with the company. Conrad had noticed that business was fine up from early Monday morning up until about noon on Saturday. And then of course, because of the work schedules of people, business just slowed down and stopped. And so he looked around and said, well, other streetcar lines must have the same problem. How do they deal with this? And so he did some research and came back that he had an answer. The answer was to create an amusement park out not far from the center of the city, and to run a car line track out to it. And so that is what he did, and this became known as Kupfrian's Park. Its basic location was just to the west of where Baptist Hospital is today, along Marino Street and G, and there were many beautiful oak trees in that area, and Kupfrian carefully built around them, and he put in a racetrack, he put in a baseball park, or baseball diamond, and this became a play place for people, and sure enough, people would come after noon on Saturday, and they would come back again on Sunday. And the park became a cardinal park because at this point in time, that was just about the only formal recreation site that we had in the entire community. It was a very successful item. Now, as we move into the 1920s, two things began to impact the streetcars. Number one, by the time we reached 1925, there are more and more automobiles in our community. I haven't got an exact number by 1925, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 to 9,000 registered vehicles were on the streets here. And of course, as more people had automobiles, those same people would ride the streetcar less frequently. And that became a serious problem. Then in 1926, the electric company, the Pensacola Electric Company, which of course had owned the electric generating service and also had owned the streetcars, they were sold, that company was sold to the newly created Gulf Power Company. Gulf, of course, was a new company. It was bringing power generated in Alabama into this area, much improving the electric service that we had here. And of course, they now also had the streetcars. And for the next 4 to 5 years, the streetcars continued to operate, but every year, the ridership began to edge down, a little bit here, a little bit there. And the Gulf Power did everything they could. They continued the 5-cent fare. They even began to sell monthly tickets to people who would ride more than a few times. They would sell a usable monthly ticket for $1.25, just doing anything to try and market the service and get more people to use it. And of course, people still did. This was a service that, for example, young people just loved to have the streetcar available because on Saturday afternoon they would love to ride the streetcar from their homes in North Hill and come down into the center of the city to go to the movies on an afternoon and have just a good time all the way around. Well, we come to the year 1929, and of course, late in that year, the Depression, the first stages of the Depression, struck the country. And as they did, month by month, you could see the effect taking place here in Pensacola. Businesses began to cut back. They began to reduce the number of employees they had. Some of the businesses closed. And of course, as that happened, this meant fewer car riders coming into the downtown area. And by the time we reached the middle of 1930, Gulf Power officials were looking at the books and saying, well, what has happened is what had been a source of profit for us now is losing money, and losing money badly. So the president of the power company met with the recently changed government here in Pensacola, which had gone to the city manager form of government we have now. This had just taken place. They sat down. They sat down together and said, the Gulf Power said, "We're sorry, but on the 1st of January, come 1931, the streetcars are going to stop. We cannot afford to keep them going." Well, unfortunately, the city fathers must have thought this was a bluff of some sort because they did not act. And sure enough, on the morning of January the 1st, if people came down to get on their usual streetcar, there was none. There was a little sign posted on any place where the cars used to stop saying, "We're sorry, there will be no further streetcars." Well, as a result of that, the system stopped, and unfortunately for the citizens of the community, the city had made no preparation for any alternative source, and of course it took months before they had even a small gasoline-operated bus service to take its place. But that is, of course, a totally different story. So the streetcars stopped. Most of the equipment was sold off. I understand that a good many of the cars were sold to cities down in South America, where they were put into play and did well there. In later times, well, we could wish that the streetcars were here. Pensacola profited greatly because if we hadn't had the streetcar, the chances are our growth to the north and to the east would have been slowed, if not halted altogether. But streetcars did the same thing for Pensacola that they did for northern cities. It was a grand period. The streetcars were fun to ride. There were many legends about the people who ran them, but that's a story of the past, and that is part of our history.